Why hello there YouTube, Flowcat here, and I have a question for you. Well, two actually. What character do you main? And also, what does that mean? You see, I've been thinking about this a lot over the past couple years while I've been playing Genshin Impact, because I had a rather weird experience with this question. When I started playing Genshin Impact, I didn't really understand the game at all. I went in rather blind. Except I had seen online some discourse about like people maining Ganyu, because she had just came out. Diluc and other characters like Mona, Ketching, you know, all these other characters. This had led me to believe that Genshin Impact was the kind of game where I needed to pick one character that I really cared about, and that character would be the focus of my entire game. It just so happened that there were a ton to pick from. And when I started playing the game, I was a little confused by the whole team swapping thing, but I kind of figured, since so many people had been talking about Benny at the time, that basically everyone thought, and kind of made me think, that all these other character slots are just there for healers, shielders, or Benny. So when I started playing the game, the very first character that I picked to be my main was Beidou. And she seemed really strong. From the early parts of the game, she could clear everything basically by herself, by parrying or activating her burst or just wailing on the enemy. I used Xinyan as a support, I used Diona as a healer and a shielder, but that did not last forever. Obviously, once you get later into the game gets a lot harder. I noticed that my Beidou's auto attacks were starting to fall behind quite considerably. Now her parry and her burst still did a lot of damage, but when her burst was down and when she had no parry and I was just wailing on the enemies, they were taking very little damage. Fights were starting to take a very long time. This led me to start considering whether things were not as simple as I had thought. And now we'll fast forward, and today, one of my favorite things to do in Genshin Impact is team building. I think team building is one of the most interesting things to do in Genshin Impact. Why? Because the characters are so varied and have such unique individual talents that can synchronize with other unique individual talents. This creates many interesting creative team compositions and rotations. The possibilities are nearly endless. But then I came back to this question. After over a year of team building and all of this other stuff, I can quite confidently say that my favorite character in the entire game is Kazuha. I love him. I think that he's probably the best character they'll ever develop for me, for my personality, and for the kind of person that I am. Kazuha is like the perfect character for me. I can quite confidently say that. But do I say that I'm a Kazuha main? Do I say that despite the fact that Kazuha is not the main DPS in almost any of the comps that I run him in? As a matter of fact, I never run Kazuha as a main DPS despite having him at C6, because I believe that his primary role in team building is as a sub DPS and a buffer. And so that's how I prefer to play him, as a sub DPS and a buffer. But you see, the issue is there are people online who would say, wait. So you main Kazuha, but he's not the main DPS? So you don't main Kazuha, is what you're saying. I think this conversation is just so convoluted, and the meaning of this word is lost. I will be exploring this idea. I want to discuss what is a main, what does that mean, and what should it mean for Genshin Impact. And I also have a couple hot takes that I'd like to throw in here as well, just to keep people riled up, because you know that's just such a fun thing to do. The first bit of this conversation is, what does it mean when you say you main a unit? Now, I think for the mental health of every Genshin gamer, we should consider a main just to be the favorite character, just to be the character that you like the most, that you relate to the most, the one that you think is coolest. You know, you like their personality, you like their voice lines, you like their quest. I think that's the most important thing when we're discussing this whole, like, who do I main thing. But I find that some people take this a bit too far, and they take it quite literally. They say, oh, well, if I main a character, I need to main that character. They need to be on field all the time. And I find this a little controversial. Now, let me jump into Genshin Impact real quick. All right, here we are in game. Now, I wanted to discuss several units that I think are quite interesting for this conversation. We have some people who will take a character like Xinyan, who is one of my favorite characters. I think that her personality is great. I think her kit is really unique and interesting, and I find her fun to build because she has a variety of builds that work very well. And it's really up to how you prefer to use her in your team comp, between the hybrid damage shield build, the full support build, or like a raw DPS build. You know what I mean? She has a lot of options. I know that some people will say that if Xinyan is your favorite character, she has to be your main DPS. And there are a lot of Xinyan mains who only run Xinyan as a main DPS. And that may seem obvious at first, but let me just jump over to a less commonly quote unquote mained character for sake of less controversy. And let's talk about Xincho. I know that he is one of the most popular sub DPSs in the entire game. Now, let's just real quick just touch on the roles of Genshin Impact to make sure that we're all on the same page in the course of this conversation, because I'm going to be tossing out names of roles, and I want everyone to understand what I mean by this. A sub DPS is a character who does probably as much damage as a DPS or supports your DPS with damage and elemental application from off field, specifically off field. They are not the one on field doing the damage. A main DPS is something that I'd like to not use as the name for an on-field DPS at this point, because we're talking about the word main. And so we're going to discuss hyper carry. Hyper carries, really quickly, before we go back to Xincho, let's just talk about Ito. He's a hyper carry, definitively, easily a hyper carry. What do I mean by that? A hyper carry is a selfish DPS that requires consistent on-field time to do their damage. They cannot do damage off-field. They are selfish. They must be on-field, and they have burst windows that are extended duration attack windows where they take field and they just do lots of damage. Hu Tao is also a hyper carry, and Zhao is also a hyper carry. Now, those are very clear examples of a hyper carry. Now, that's what I'm going to be, when I talk about a main DPS, I'm not going to probably use that term. I'm probably going to use hyper carry, but that is what I mean by that, okay? A burst DPS is a unit that does a lot of on-field damage in a very short amount of time. Not nearly as selfish as a hyper carry, like they don't need the full, like half a rotation or more of time to do their damage. It's rather quick. We could consider like Jean as a healer slash burst DPS, because her burst and her skill take very little time to use, but do a good amount of damage in a short time. Other examples of burst DPSs would be like Ayaka's burst, which does an incredible amount of damage in a short time, as well as characters like Mona, who, as everyone knows, does a lot of damage in a very short time with her burst. Specifically. Okay. The burst part is not necessary. You could be a burst DPS with your skill, but it's just that it's done very quickly in a short amount of time. Healers are obvious. They heal. And the only other role is like buffer roles or like utility roles. So like we have shielders, we have cooldown reduction, we have stamina consumption reduction, we have damage buffing, attack buffing. All those other things I just throw under utility, because there's so many different unique attributes that certain characters have. Crit buffing, you know, HP buffing, defense buffing. There's so many different things that like it's just easier to throw them under a broad category of utility. Okay, back to Xincho. So now that we're all caught up on roles and we all agree on what roles are and what we're talking about, he is a sub DPS, does all his damage off field. If you love him and he's your favorite character in the entire game, you may feel compelled to play him on field. You may feel compelled by the nature of this conversation, by the community. Who do you main? Oh, well, he's my favorite character. I want to main him. Oh, well, how are you going to do that from him doing damage on field? Are you going to use Benny to buff his on-field damage? Are you going to build physical Xinjo? How are you going to do that? It gets very complicated very quickly. And one thing I'd like to say is that he's the kind of character, like if you talk about his personality, who he is, a young man carrying a longsword who's frequently seen at the book booth. He's chivalrous at heart and yearns for justice and fairness at all. He's a shy young man who cares about justice. So the fact that he does damage off field actually fits his personality, and it would be unlike him to be the main on-field DPS. He is the kind of person to plot in the backgrounds, to strategize, and to support and strike at precise and calculated moments to deal maximum damage, you know? And that's kind of what he does. In this conversation, I feel like it's kind of weird because the whole nature of like what these characters are built to do is lost between people deciding like, oh, I'm a Kaya main, so he always has to be on-field main DPS. Like, even if you're a Kaya main, even if you have an on-field main DPS Kaya, you could still build a sub DPS Kaya. There's nothing wrong with that. Maybe there are situations where that would be useful to you, and maybe you don't enjoy that. Fine, but let's not act like that isn't an option, right? And so there are a lot of characters where people main them and they force them into the main DPS category when that's probably not the most efficient usage of the character. I do want to say really quickly about Xinyan. I recently posted a video discussing how I believe she is needed to be built. You have C2, you ignore crit rate, and you only build attack, defense, crit damage, energy recharge. Those are the only 4 stats she needs. It allows you to balance her. I get 14,000 shield. I get 7.2, like 7,000 shield per shield. I get 1 for my skill, 1 for my burst. That's 14,000 shield. She does 70,000 damage per burst. She does good. She does good. And I don't need much energy recharge. I run her with Raiden Shogun. Anyway, there was a person who commented on my video and essentially said like, I'm a Xinyan main. Do not build Xinyan this way. She will suck. This is incorrect. The issue is that they build Xinyan as a main on-field DPS with 2-piece Pale Flame, 2-piece Bloodstain, and they build crit rate on their Xinyan. That is a way to build her. That is the main DPS Xinyan build. But that's not how I recommend people to build her, because most people don't want to play her as a main on-field DPS. If you do, great. But most people want to use her for her shield and for a very quick burst DPS who does a lot of damage and enables a lot of pyro application in a very short window of time. That's what she's good at. That's what she does. And so that's what I recommend. I recommend people to build like a 2-piece Pale Flame, 2-piece Husk, or a 2-piece Husk, 2-piece Shimenawa. And yes, you can even do a 2-piece Pale Flame, 2-piece Bloodstain while still maintaining a decent defense for her shield. It really just depends on the team, the weapons you want to use. There are so many options. You can use White Blind, you can use Wolf's Gravestone, you can use Sacrificial Sword, you can use Favonius Sword, you can use the Tuna, you can use Archaic. You can use so many different sword options for her, and it really, Skyward Pride, the freaking Redhorn Stone Thresher. You can use so many, okay? It just depends on your team. It depends on what you need from her. And telling people that you have to build her this way and only this way is incorrect because it is factually not true. Small rant aside, there are certain characters that get treated really poorly with this. Like, for some reason, people seem to think that if you can't build Xinyan as a main on-field DPS, that she's useless. And people seem to believe that her shield is not good and that she can't do good burst damage. But that's just simply not true. I mean, my Xinyan isn't even max invested. So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm rambling and ranting about her. Another instance of people kind of getting it wrong when it comes to character roles would be Diluc. I think that he's not a traditional hyper carry. First of all, his infusion window does not end when he swaps off. Every other hyper carry cannot swap off mid thing, you know, and like him and Noelle are basically the only ones, okay? And so I wouldn't really consider him like a traditional hyper carry. And also, his burst is 40 cost and a 12-second cooldown. I think that really, Diluc is primarily, now get this, primarily a burst DPS. He can swap on, do a lot of damage really fast, and swap off. He doesn't have to stay on field to do that damage. He gets compared a ton to Hu Tao. Hu Tao cannot swap off. She is forced to be on field during her infusion window. And her burst is a 60 cost with a 50-second cooldown. And her burst is not nearly as flexible as Diluc. And it has to be done from inside of her skill state. She's extremely restrictive. So even though she can be used as a burst DPS, I think she's primarily a hyper carry. Now this is where I think roles get really confusing in Genshin Impact, because characters often have a primary role and a secondary role that they can fulfill, or maybe there's a gap in your team, like a small gap in your team, and you have Hu Tao as your hyper carry, but you also kind of want to burst DPS. Well, she can sort of do both, okay? And then let's go back to Diluc. He's primarily a burst DPS. He's got this extremely spammable burst, huge AoE, hits a ton of enemies. You can do tons of reaction damage very quickly with his burst and skill and swap him off. If you need to keep him on field for longer stretches of time, he also has this infusion window that allows him to do on-field DPS if need be. But it is not, in my opinion, his optimal role. His optimal role is a burst DPS. Let's talk about catching. Same argument. I think 40 cost burst, 12-second cooldown. She has stamina problems because she's not supposed to be on field all the time. She has a short infusion window. She does all of her damage in a short window of time. And I found great success using her in team comps, where you get her on field, you do a bunch of damage really fast, and then you swap off and do some other thing. And people may be wondering at this point, well, these standard banner characters, why are they all like burst DPS? Like, why wouldn't they put a hyper carry on the standard banner? And the reason why is because hyper carries are extremely restrictive. A hyper carry has one team build that'll like work. Like most of the time, there's one or two, maybe three builds that you can do for a hyper carry for them to succeed. They have specific supports they require. They have specific reactions they require. They have specific situations they require to be fulfilled in order to do maximum damage. And that's very important. So when you're using a hyper carry, you are often restricted in team building. It makes sense that on the standard banner, they would give us burst DPSs because they are more flexible in team building and can do they can fit in tons of different comps. If you get a main hyper carry you like, you could use one of these characters as a burst DPS for your hyper carry. Like when your hyper carry's down, you could swap over to a burst DPS. Boom. And so it allows them to maintain adaptability within team building as the game ages. That was a lot. All right, I get it. Okay, talking about roles, talking about all sorts of things. And I think just the primary thing about this video that I wanted to get across is that I think it's kind of toxic to say that if you main a character, to use that terminology at all, it creates a misconception from people who are not engaged with team building, maybe people that are casual, maybe people that aren't playing the game and start playing the game. They get this conception that, oh, I need to main a character, I need to find a favorite character, and then that character has to be on field all the time for the rest of time, no matter what. And that teaches poor team building. We have characters that have so many various functions within team building compositions, and really, these characters function best when they work together with other characters and do what they're best at doing. Not force them or pigeonhole them into a role that they don't really fit in, but they can fit in, because, I mean, with Genshin Impact, we all know it's support impact. Like, if you support any character, they can be on field doing the damage, and they're just a driver. Like, they're just a driver for the sub DPS. And now what's a driver? A driver is just a character that's on field, applying element, or just spamming the click button in order for sub DPSs to trigger their attack. So like a lot of sub DPSs have triggers where you gotta auto attack, or you gotta, you know, do various things to trigger their effects. And so the on-field driver can be a character that maybe they're not a hyper carry, maybe they're not even a main DPS, but they're on a field and they're driving the team forward. They're just spam and attack or whatever they're doing. Now, yes, that works and you can do that. And that's the beauty of the game, is that you can do whatever you want. But I think that the issue is that it creates this conception where like, I'm a Xinchu main, I do on-field main DPS Xinchu, and then there becomes this toxic mindset in some of those people, not all. Some of those people get this toxic mindset that they're better than other people who care about Xinchu because they've taken the time to make him, to warp his role, to force him into a role that, frankly, I don't even think as a character he would want to do. Why would he want to be the main DPS? He just wants to read his books and stand back. That's literally what he does in his quest when you meet him. So I got opinions. I just, it's confusing. It's really confusing. And team building is important in Genshin. I've seen a lot of people have a poor experience of the game because they simply do not understand team building and they don't understand how to make the characters they care about shine. They think they suck. They think the characters that they love suck because they're not a hyper carry. They're not Hu Tao. They're not Ganyu. They're not Zhao. They're not this, that, or another. But there are tons of characters in this game that are extremely popular for not being a main DPS. Diona, for example. All she does is shield, heal, and do utility like stamina consumption reduction. But she's extremely popular. She's one of the most used shielder healers in the game because she's fantastic at her kit, at her role. You put her on your team and you have very little survivability issues as long as she's properly built. And now I want to turn the conversation over to you guys. What do you think about my take? You know, is it kind of unhealthy for us to force this conception of like, oh, main this character equals they are on field all the time, no exceptions? Or is it kind of whatever and you just don't care? I think it promotes unhealthy views of team building. I think it kind of forces people to feel pressured to do certain things with characters that may not work very well, and then they get frustrated because it's like literally not what's intended for the character in the first place. And yeah, it creates problems. And I'm curious about it. I wonder what you guys think as consumers of YouTube content and not content creators for the game. But yeah, that's pretty much all I gotta say. That's pretty much it. I mean, it's you got these thoughts running around in my brain, okay? And I gotta talk about them sometime. So that's basically gonna be what I'm doing with videos. I do a lot of streaming on YouTube, as you may know if you follow me. I stream quite often, like every other day on YouTube. Genshin Impact, fun times, swell community, active Discord. We're living the dream out here in the Oasis, and we are inviting you to join us. If you would like to partake in this community, I would love to see you in my streams. And also the Discord link will be in the pinned comment. It's also in my descriptions of my videos. Love to see you there. Please drop a like and subscribe. And as always, stay healthy, stay hydrated. Peace.